history, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyah, the thought of him and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, medieval Islamic theology, philosophy, etc., etc., and his PhDs from the University of Birmingham. And I found he's got a BS in mechanical engineering, so there's a lovely career shift there, I think, that takes place. But I think the process where we're going to work today, I'm going to give over to Professor Hoover very shortly. Professor Hoover will present on the reading that he gave us for around, he said 15 to 20 minutes, but feel free, Professor, take your time. And then after that, he will hopefully open up for questions, and I will hopefully moderate the Q&A, inshallah ta'ala. So thank you very much, Professor Hoover, for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Safaruk. And thank you to the Karima Foundation for inviting me. That's really a great honor to be with you. Ramadan Kareem to everybody. And Eid Mubarak for the Eid that's coming up. This morning, I thought I would go through the pages that I sent beforehand for reading and highlight key points. And I'll put the pages up on the screen in a moment. And then after that, we can have a Q&A session for a good length of time. So, and we can go beyond what is in the reading if there's interest. So I'm going to share the reading on the screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah? Okay, so this is chapter 7 in my recent book. It's just the first part. Can you see it?
No, it has a cover.
Okay. So I've added some notes to the side of the reading to highlight key points I want to bring out for, to highlight what's happening here in the text. The first thing, to situate the chapter, I've added a note.
We can't see. It's not presenting.
You can't see it. Let me try again. Oh, I see. Okay, just a second. Sorry for this delay.
No worries.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. So, I sent the reading ahead of time, the first part of chapter 7, God and Creation. And to situate this chapter in the wider context of the book, especially chapters 3 through chapters 8, I'm trying to show in the systematic presentation of Ibn Taymiyah's thought that there is an overriding concern for worship. And theology then, or foundations of religion, comes within that overriding concern. So Ibn Taymiyah is fundamentally concerned that human beings worship God exclusively, and then worship God by means of the Sharia, means of the religious law, and avoid everything that's not in the religious law, which is bid'ah, which is innovation. So it's a very simple, basic outline of what what Ibn Taymiyah thinks human beings are here for. We're here to worship God, and we should seek to do that through God's law. Now, theology comes into that as the attempt to sort out what is the best way to think about God. And so there's a practical aim to theology, which I talk a little bit more about on page 113. This chapter begins by outlining three larger groups or opponents of Ibn Taymiyah: the Kalam theologians, the esotericists, non-cognitivists. The terms aren't perhaps so ideal, but it's the best I could come up with. Kalam theology, I talk mainly about Fakhruddin al-Razi. He's the greatest figure in the background of Ibn Taymiyah. He's Ash'ari theologian, died in 1210, and he is really Ibn Taymiyah's nemesis, number one. Al-Razi, there's a lot of things one can say about him, but for our purposes this morning, it's the idea that reason dictates that God is not corporeal, spatial, or located. And this, of course, is a widespread conviction within the Muslim tradition that God is not a body. And I situate that at the bottom of the page within the broader Hellenistic tradition of reason, which says that God is not corporeal. So out of that, I believe last week you were doing something on the tafweed and ta'wil or something like that. Anyway, Razi has this rule of interpretation, which talks about how we deal with so-called anthropomorphisms in the Quran and the Hadith. So if the Quran says God is sitting over the throne, and I use sitting here, I don't mean to offend anybody with that translation of istiwa, but that's what I'm going to use to talk about this issue, because it highlights the tensions that are involved in the verse and in the discussion. So for Razi, God's sitting over the throne, we have to deny corporeality first. We deny that God has a body. And then secondly, we need to either delegate the meaning to God, that's tafweed, or reinterpret ta'wil. We reinterpret sitting as possessing or as vanquishing or something like that. So that's the basics from Razi. And Ibn Taymiyah's fundamental counter to Razi is that he rejects this whole idea that God has to be declared explicitly incorporeal. That doesn't mean Ibn Taymiyah is saying God is corporeal, doesn't mean Ibn Taymiyah is saying God is a body, but is simply rejecting that God is not a body. And the term body doesn't appear in the Quran, and that's why Ibn Taymiyah is not willing to say that God is a body or God is not a body. But at the core of this rejection of incorporealism, we have Ibn Taymiyah's empiricism. Basically, everything that exists in the world can be seen. I shouldn't say that. Everything that exists at all, whether in the world or outside the world, can be seen and is, in some sense, spatial, even though that word's not in the Quran. So there's nothing incorporeal, nothing non-spatial exists outside the mind. The only way you can think about incorporeal existence is, well, you're just thinking about them. That's all there is to it. So whether it's in the ghaib, in the unseen, or whether it's in the seen, all existence are, well, to use the language, self-substantiating or self-existent. So that's Ibn Taymiyah's response to Razi in a nutshell. Then we have this other category of his opponents, esotericism, basically the philosophers, Falasifa, Ibn Sina. I give an example here. And Ibn Taymiyah's response to the likes of the philosophers is that their speculations don't actually exist outside the mind. So there's no reality to what they're talking about outside the mind. And then there's a third opponent that has been kind of hidden in until recently in the research, but he steps out away from the Hanbali traditionalism, or also the Shafi'i traditionalism, the kind of traditionalism which would say that we just cannot say anything about the meaning of God's attributes. We need to pass over them as we recite them in the Quran. So it's the idea of imrar. We just move along. We don't allow ideas to come to our minds. We say God is all powerful. We say God is sitting on the throne, and we just do that because we're reciting the Quran, but we don't think about it. And so there's no access to the meaning of God's attributes, nor the modality, the ma'na or the kaif. And a very clear articulation of this position is Ibn Qudama in the 13th century, a Hanbali theologian. Okay, so those are the three major opponents. Now we move on to what I'm calling apologetic interpretativism, which is Ibn Taymiyah's position. And I'm sorry if there's flickering on the screen. Let me see if I can stop that. Okay. For Ibn Taymiyah, as opposed to Ibn Qudama, the meaning of God's attributes are known. And it's the modality that's not known, but the meaning is known. And that has major implications. It means that Ibn Taymiyah can start arguing with other people about what God's attributes mean. And then, to put it quite bluntly, when he gets stuck or when he doesn't quite know what to do, or when he simply doesn't want to, he thinks he's going too far, he's going beyond what would be permissible in terms of Quran and Hadith, he simply says, well, that's God's monality. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to leave that in a sense of the unknown. So we do, though, discuss the meaning. And this is where he breaks with the other traditionalists. He is a traditionalist himself in that he believes the Quran and the Hadith that God has given through the Prophet, the meanings of, has given what we're supposed to say about theological matters, and God has given us the meaning. God has given us the words, and since God's given us the meanings through the Prophet, we can then, discuss with other people what the attributes of God mean. So I moved on now to page 112. The task of theology for Ibn Taymiyah is then to interpret these meanings correctly over against rival interpretations. And he talks about this in a couple different places in his work as kind of an exercise in translation. So he affirms that the Quran can be translated, and likewise that the different attributes of God can be interpreted in other terms, even other languages, in order to help other people understand, especially people who have wrong understandings, to correct their understandings. Then moving on to page 113. Yes, I mentioned this earlier. The practical aim of theology is to give God the highest praise and the highest worship. In other words, if our primary purpose in life is to worship God, then we want to worship God correctly, rightly, and we worship God rightly through following God's law. And part of God's law, or part of the religious law, part of the Sharia, is in fact a correct articulation of God and his attributes and what they mean from Ibn Taymiyah's point of view. Then there's the Ibn Taymiyah's by now famous claim that revelation or revealed tradition and reason do not contradict, that they agree fundamentally, and you get discussions of the fitrah surrounding this claim as well. This is what I call an apologetic claim. He is claiming that this is the case. Of course, people who are in the Kalam tradition will disagree. People who are in the tradition of Falsafa will disagree. And others may disagree as well. But he makes this claim frequently and quite thoroughly, actually, in his writings, his theological writings. And it extends over into his understandings of jurisprudence as well, in terms of the practical aspects, how we act. He believes as well that the revelation agrees with what is rational in terms of what provides the most benefit. So there's a deep, profound consistency in what Ibn Taymiyah is doing throughout his writings, whether it's in what we think of as theology or whether it's in what we think of as jurisprudence. In any case, this conviction of his, this claim of his, is rooted in his belief that the Quran makes rational arguments and that those arguments agree with an exercise of reason apart from revelation that is correct. So I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but here's a quotation from an earlier work of mine. Revelation embodies true rationality. Now, Ibn Taymiyah makes a claim that the Quran's way of arguing about God's attributes is the a fortiori argument. Very simply, that means if something is a perfection in human beings, then God has all the more right to it. This doesn't mean that the perfection in human beings is in any sense like God's perfection, in that it's similar. It's not analogous in the sense of a kind of analogy like the analogy between grape wine and and date wine used in jurisprudence and so on. But there's some sense in which we can talk about God's attributes and our attributes being, if I dare say, similar, in the sense that God has all the more right to the perfections we have as human beings. And why does God have the right to those perfections? So on the next page, I highlight here on the right-hand side, God's right to perfection is rooted in causal priority. So God is the cause of everything. Causes are more perfect than their effects, and so God is, has that greater right to perfection. Also, God is the creator of all the perfections that we have in creatures, and so God is therefore more worthy of those perfections. So that is the fundamental kind of rational theology of Ibn Taymiyah. We look at ourselves and what are the perfections we find in ourselves, and then we say, well, God has all the greater right to those. And that can be, in one work especially called Akmaliyah, he works that out without direct reference to the Quran and the Hadith. So that brings us, with that methodological background, it brings us to perhaps one of the most difficult questions in Islamic theology. How do we interpret what are called the mutashabihat, or the verses that seem to imply some kind of anthropomorphism? I mentioned before God sitting over the throne. And how do we hold that together with God is with you wherever you are? So Ibn Taymiyyah has a different approach to this than the Kalam theologians. And I outline some key points. First of all, Ibn Taymiyyah rejects literalism as a theory of language. This is extremely important to understand what Ibn Taymiyyah is doing. If you don't get this and you read him through a literalist theory of meaning, you think he's simply cheating or disingenuous or any number of other things you might want to call him. So he argues that he argues for what we might call a theory of contextualist theory of language, where the meanings of words are dependent entirely on their contexts. So I give the example of lion as an example. So a literalist would say the literal meaning of lion is a big cat you find in the savannas of Africa, and it's fierce. You don't want to get in front of it. You don't want to meet it in the wilderness. It's dangerous. Whereas the figurative sense of lion is if you call a valiant soldier a lion, you don't mean he's a lion in the savannah. You mean he's brave. And that's a non-literal meaning or a metaphorical meaning. And Ibn Taymiyyah says that the term lion has no literal meaning. You cannot know what it means just hearing the word lion. It is dependent entirely on context. You've got to know whether the term lion is surrounded by, let's say, some information about the savannah in Africa, or whether it's surrounded by a battlefield, in which case the word lion is no way connected to the wild cat. It's connected to the valiant soldier. So there is no literal meaning. It's always dependent on context. Point one. Okay, second point is Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology is that God is above the world, in the sense that God is not confined to the intellectual realm. God is not here with us ontologically, in the sense that if God were that way, God would be in as Ibn Taymiyyah says, he'd be in the toilets, he would be in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and so on. So God cannot be in those places. So God is above the world in an ontological sense. Now, given that, we move to hermeneutical issues. So we interpret God's withness in the sense of God is with you wherever you are. You have to interpret that within the context that's established of God being above. So God being above means that God cannot be here with us in an ontological sense. It has to be in some other sense, which is it's in the sense of God knows what's going on, who we are, what we're doing. He's very intimately aware of everything in our lives and cares. It's a caring knowledge. It's not just a sense of, oh, well, something's going on down there. So this understanding of God's withness then is, in the sense of God's knowledge, is the plain sense. It's a Zahir sense, because once you take that context of God being above the world, that's the only sense that makes sense. There is no literal and non-literal sense. It's not reinterpretation of the literal sense non-literally. It's not a ta'wil, he would argue. Right, so a little bit more, this ontology, or God being above, runs flat in the face of Fakhruddin Razi and the whole Ash'ari tradition, And al-Ghazālī, you've been reading the Risalah Qudsiyyah, it doesn't fit with that. And Ibn Taymiyah, especially in one work, which Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, I call it Explication of the Deceit of the Jahmiyyah, he undoes Razi's point of view. Just give you the main points on the right. God is above the world from any point on the surface of a spherical earth, as God surrounds the earth. So Razi says, well, if you have a spherical earth and one person's on one side, like on the east, and they look up and they see God above them, and the other person on the west looks up and they see God above them, basically you have God on two completely different directions from the earth, and this is silly and stupid, so obviously God cannot be above in any kind of spatial sense. Ibn Taymiyah says, well, in fact, God can be surrounding the earth. He doesn't say that explicitly. Instead, as I indicate here, he says that the whole world is in the hand of God. It's like a chickpea in one of our hands. So if you close your hand and surround the chickpea, of course, there's a sense in which your whole hand is surrounding the chickpea. In a similar sense, God is surrounding the world. Another key point, for Ibn Taymiyah, divine unity is organic. It's not utterly simple. And for Razi, if you have anything that's spatially extended or bodily, it's divisible. You can chop it up, you can put it back together. Whereas Ibn Taymiyah says, in no way can God be chopped up, in no way can God be put back together. God never was a bunch of parts which were put together sometime. In no way is that the case. And yet we don't have to say that God is utterly simple in a philosophical sense. The unity is rather organic. So then on the next page, which is the end of the part I gave you, I talk briefly about Ibn Taymiyah's view of God is in a sense of a being who is spatially extended. He doesn't like to use that language, but in trying to explain to the Kalam theologians why they're wrong, there's a sense in which God is a very large being who completely surrounds the universe and is that's it. So God is up in every direction from the world. So thank you for allowing me to go over those main points, and I'm happy to discuss anything we'd like to discuss.
Thank you very much, Professor. So if anybody has questions, if you could just put in the chat box, I have a question. I hope that while Professor was speaking, people were formulating their questions. The one request I will make is that because we don't have the Professor for the next 7 hours, we only have him for, I think, however long he can give us time. And I feel like a lot of people will want to interact with him now. Try not to take too much time laying out your questions, but there will be a back and forth in discussions and stuff. But just bear in mind that there will be other people wanting to join in at certain points. But if anybody does have a question or comment or anything, Sirisala, do you want to come onto the mic, or do you want me to read your question out?
Shall I read the question? Okay.
He wants to come on actually, so Sirisala, you can turn your mic on. Sasada, you can turn your mic on if you want. Or should I don't know where he's gone. Oh, sorry, he's just turning it on, I think. I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. So while you're figuring that out, I'll go to Maulana Uwais. Is there
Assalamu alaikum.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Apologies. Sorry, I just wasn't sure of this interface. So, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much for that information. I just had a quick question, if possible. Have you done come across any materials or looked at how Ibn Taymiyah links in with the other Hanbalis? So, for example, there were Hanbalis who wrote in defense of him, but they obviously tried to interpret his words in a way which kind of fits in with their, like a different Hanbali understanding. Because Ibn Taymiyah, he mentions in one of his works that he actually changed his views. He kind of I can't remember the exact passage. He changed his views from what his forefathers were upon in terms of belief, and then also he in fiqh wise as well. He changed his views as well. So, for example, there's a scholar that came after him, Ibn Qa'id al-Najdi, who was a Hanbali based in Egypt from Najd. He has a work, Najat al-Khalaf, where the later chapters he kind of summarizes Ibn Taymiyyah's Tadmuriyah. But the initial chapters, he kind of, for example, that issue you were talking about God being elevated in a direction, he initially, Ibn Qa'id says, whoever believes such a thing is a disbeliever, that God is limited to a spatial location. But then later on, he kind of affirms the direction. So it's like he's trying to synthesize Ibn Taymiyyah into a traditional Ahmadi understanding. I just wanted to know whether you might have come across anything or you researched into this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, there's particularly the book by Khalid al-Ruwayhib on the intellectual history in the 17th century. There's a section in there on, let's see, trying to think the gentleman's name. Kirmani? No, it's not Kirmani. Anyway, there's a discussion in there about how certain trends try to reconcile Ibn Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah. And there is a tendency, it's not just any individual, but there's a tendency among some to try to dumb down, if you will, Ibn Taymiyyah's, they try to, let's put it simply, they try to assimilate him to the tafweed position of the mainstream Ash'ari theology. So he's just doing tafweed. But that ignores his theological argumentation, and it ignores his explicit rejection of incorporealism. So it's an attempt to bring Ibn Taymiyyah into a mainstream perspective to make him palatable and useful in a context where any kind of rejection of incorporealism is not allowed. So yeah, I don't know of any. Well, there's the also Khalid al-Ruwayhib has an article in the Ibn Taymiyyah in his Times book as well, where it's even very much more explicit, this kind of attempt to make Ibn Taymiyyah fit into the tafweed paradigm, tafweed paradigm, by saying he's doing tafweed. So yeah, there's the 2010 Ibn Taymiyyah in his Times book, has a long article by Khalid al-Ruwayhib, and then Khalid al-Ruwayhib has a section in his more recent 17th century intellectual history book. And there's other stuff on this as well, but it's not as extensive.
Molna Owais, you had a question? Do you want to come in? Or if you don't want to tell your boycott, I could just ask the question for you. Okay, he's asking, is there a reason why the professor translated ta'wil as reinterpretation instead of just interpretation?
Right. So I'm taking the initial step. I mentioned Fakhruddin Razi talks about, or there's basically two steps. This gets much more systematized in later kalam. As explicitly two steps. First is rejection of corporeality. So I think of that as an interpretive step. And then that's interpretation. It is an active interpretation to say that God's, let's say, sitting is incorporeal. Then a reinterpretation of the term sitting or istiwa is a second interpretation. I call that a reinterpretation. So I use that term reinterpretation for ta'wil to implicitly recognize that it's a two-step process.
I had a couple of questions, actually, if that's okay. The first one, could you just elaborate again a bit on the idea of this, the perfection thesis that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah had about if humans have a certain quality on attribute, then God must have it on a more perfect scale. Didn't he get any accusations then on his own? Like that seems very. Then that like didn't he get accusations of tajseem or tashbih at that point? That how can you use that as an argument?
Okay, let me come back to that. First of all, I see in the chat that some people are reminding me it's Ibrahim Qurani that I was trying to remember. So thank you for that. As one who is trying to reconcile Ibn Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah on God's attributes. So let's go back. Is the question, does Ibn Taymiyyah's a fortiori argumentation from, does that involve him? Does it make him say things which get him charged with?
Yes.
Yes, it does. I mean, he says, for example, that God's that motion is an attribute of perfection, and so therefore, the fact we can move is more perfect than our not being able to move. So therefore, God is all the more worthy of being ascribed with movement. And so if you're of the view that a God who moves is somehow involved with time and space and corporeality, then of course you're going to reject that. And yeah, there's all sorts of, I mean, he talks about, someone who can act with their hand. So if I can perform an action with my hand, and that is a more perfect, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, that's a greater perfection than somebody who can't act with their hand. And so we ascribe a hand to God by virtue of ascribing, we want to ascribe to God the greatest perfection. So if you, again, if that implies too much if that implies corporeality, then you reject that and say, well, the word hand has to be reinterpreted. So yes, his whole method, I mean, I think the method itself, we have to clarify this. There's some recent research by Farid Suleiman. It's a book came out in German last year, 2019, where he identifies that this whole method of the a fortiori argument, the argument from perfection, is actually something that Al-Amidi, the Ash'ari theologian Al-Amidi, also used, but he confined it, if I recall correctly, to God's basic 7 attributes, the Ash'ari attributes of knowledge, speech, power, and so forth. But Ibn Taymiyyah extends that to, it's the same intellectual move. Ibn Taymiyyah then extends that to all the attributes of God, or all the names and attributes of God that we find in the Quran. And he ends up where he does, which then the Ash'ari tradition would reject as corporealist.
Just a quick follow-up from me. What is Ibn Taymiyyah's definition of corporealism? At what point does he feel? Because you mentioned the chickpea thing, and like if anybody hears that, you automatically assume that sounds pretty corporeal. But at what point will he say, or where does he say? Where does he? I don't know, the blurred line. Where does it sort of stop, or where does it start? His definition of corporealism.
But to go back to the very beginning, there is no corporealism because the term doesn't appear in the Quran. That's the baseline. And Hisham ibn Hakam, the early Shi'i, is famous in the heresiographies as being reported as affirming God has a body and so on. So Ibn Taymiyyah rejects Hisham ibn Hakam's corporealism. I mean, he says, that's wrong. Then, when he starts moving into explaining how he understands God's existence, God's being, in kalam terms, he starts using kalam terms. And here he's going to clarify, he doesn't speak too much in terms of jism, but body, but rather more in tahayyuz and spatial extension, at least in the text I've been reading more recently. Then he says, well, if we're going to speak in kalam terms, terms that don't exist within the Quranic text, within the the revealed tradition, within the hadith and the Quran, then this is what it means. It's an organic unity, as I explained earlier. It's not a simple unity. He would come back and say to the Ash'aris, well, like Ar-Razi accepts and Ash'aris in general accept that God's attributes of power and knowledge and speech subsist in God's essence. They aren't just names for God's essence. They somehow subsist in God's essence. And Ibn Taymiyah says, so why not also qadr, or dimension, not dimension, but extension? There's really nothing to extend the way in which God's unity is organic. And that actually makes more sense in view of his other, the whole set of convictions which he brings to the table. So he's very, very reticent to speak about corporealism because it's simply not a term in the Quran, and even when he's talking about he's very reticent to use the word jism or tajsim because he knows it's going to get him in trouble. He knows it's very sensitive, and so he avoids it. Almost all the time. But his conviction is that to defend him, the whole Razian approach and Falsafa, that if you confine God's existence to, as Ar-Razi says, that God is neither inside the world nor outside the world, then as far as Ibn Taymiyah is concerned, God doesn't exist at all. Anything has kind of just an intellectual existence only exists in the mind. And that is it's tantamount as far as Ibn Taymiyah is concerned to a kind of, unbelief, although he doesn't go that far. He doesn't accuse these people of unbelief. Maybe unbelief, but they're not unbelievers. He's not rejecting people easily, but he's trying to articulate what he thinks the Quran and the Hadith mean in view of these other positions.
See, Risalah, do you want to turn your mic on for your question, or shall I just read it out? And if you want to turn your mic on, just go ahead and turn your mic on. Okay. Is there any credence to Ibn Taymiyyah repentance mentioned in some text?
Okay, I'm not. This reminds me, I didn't speak to the earlier issue about Ibn Taymiyyah changing his mind on some reason, and some issues, and I'm not sure if that's what's intended here. But in an earlier article I wrote myself, again, and it's in that Ibn Taymiyyah in his Times volume back in 2010, I have a quotation where he says, when it comes to what he calls God's voluntary attributes, God's acting by his will and power, he says that he was on the position of his forefathers, and he changed his view when he came to understand the truth. So there's a sense in which he changes his mind in various issues. But I would like to ask, I see it's Salih Malik, is that right? What exactly are you referring to? Deathbed repentance. I'm not aware of that. I perhaps have missed something in the literature, but I have not encountered anything about him repenting on his deathbed. And said he was Ash'ari. There is a text in the Hadith Encyclopedia. I'm sorry, not Hadith Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia, just an encyclopedia in general, of an-Nawairi, who was a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah, an historian, and he's a bureaucrat in Cairo. And he has an account of Ibn Taymiyyah in which this is in 1307. I mentioned it in my book, in chapter 2 of my book, the most recent book, where he affirms what is essentially the tafweed position of the Ash'aris. And I say in the book, I think there are reasons to accept that he actually did that, but of course it was a matter of getting himself out of jail for pragmatic reasons. And I'm working very slowly on are, working all that out. I want to turn this into a very long article or a short book. And I presented on this in different academic forums in the last couple of years. So I think he probably did. I won't use the word repent, but he simply signed a retraction statement for the purposes of getting past that particular hurdle in his life, because there were threats to his life through all that. I'm not sure how serious it was, but it was a very sticky situation. So perhaps that's what you're referring to.
While see the silent figures. Oh yes, thank you. Okay, we'll start Imran, if you would like to turn your mic on and ask a question.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Professor Hoover, for your enlightening talk and subsequent answers. I have a couple of questions. One, could you maybe demarcate between the Ashri Tafweed and the Imrar kind of mechanisms of the likes of Ibn Qudama? Is there a distinction between those, or are they essentially reducible to one principle, which is negating the meaning and the modality? Because obviously you've got the likes of Ibn Kathir, Dhahabi, and so on and so forth. So the Athari school seems to be very within a spectrum of different positions. So that's the first one. Should I ask all three questions or let you do one at a time?
Let's do one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is something I perhaps don't always get clear in my own head, the difference between Tafweed of the Ashari tradition and Imrar and the Athari tradition, or the traditionalist tradition. But what strikes me here is Tafweed, you can still argue rationally for the incorporeality of God. So you still have your rational arguments that you bring to the table. Whereas the traditionalist would say, normally we just shouldn't engage in these kinds of arguments. We should abandon Kalam completely. So you can be a good Kalam, you can be a good Ashari Kalam theologian and adopt a Tafweed position. And you give all your arguments for why God's incorporeal, why God's atemporal, and so on, just as Fakhruddin Arazi does. But then when it comes to the question of, shall we now, indicate a meaning for God's sitting or God's hand and so on, no, we simply leave that to God. We don't do the ta'wil. Whereas with Imrar and the Athari traditionalist position in general, of like a Dhahabi and Ibn Qudama, we shouldn't be involved in argumentation. We might, there's a small line in Ibn Qudama's treatise that I refer to in my book, where he does deny corporeality, but he doesn't argue for it. He doesn't engage in rational argumentation for it. So you should just keep moving along and not think about it. So I would say that the big difference is whether you engage in kalam argumentation or not. Is that helpful?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for that. Yeah, so you're saying basically the Kalamic school is contingent on the philosophical assumptions and the argumentation, whereas the Imrar position doesn't have that particular type of foundation. It's more just we won't even deal with it.
That's my understanding. I mean, the Imrar approach and the Athari school, it's a matter of we base faith, we base the whole religion on texts. We base it on our God's action in the world. It's not based on arguments. It's based on other things.
So conceptually, would you say then, if we ignore the foundation of the kalam or the scriptural theology, but in terms of a mechanism, could they be reduced to the same principle in terms of they both negate the meaning and modality? And obviously the reason why they do it is different, because they come from different methodological perspectives.
Yeah, they're very close. I would have to do more research. I mean, it's actually a question I've had myself. Your question is a question I've had myself, and I just haven't had time to delve into it deeply enough to see if they're really the same or if there's some further difference than I've articulated.
Okay, thank you for that. My second question is regarding the relational attributes of Ibn Taymiyah. So you've alluded to the issue of extension in terms of jihad, the issue of time. Do you believe that Ibn Taymiyah has a kind of divine space-time in which his perpetual notion of God, perpetually creating, perpetually interacting, something uber kind of personal God? Do you think he has a kind of space-time concept which is divine and different from temporal space-time?
I mean, yes. Okay, let me give a little
Can I say
background.
the only reason I ask is because there seems to be a notion of change. Now, obviously, we can't have change in the context of temporal change, which is the issues of accidents and atoms and so on and so forth. But if we have a divine kind of space-time where there's perpetual creativity, so you go from position A to position B, but that's because it's divine. It's not the same as, for example, human time. 40 Ori is different. So it's something that I've tried to conceive how he conceives of it. But anyway, that's my ideas on that.
Yeah, so there's basic principle here is that time and space do not derive from, they don't self-exist. They only derive from the objects in which they, okay, let's take space. There is no space except where there is existence. So it's not a Platonic approach to space. It's Aristotelian approach to space. There is no void. That's, yeah, put it that way. There's no void. There's no empty space. And likewise, there's no time self-subsisting. If you take all of the creation away, if you take all existence away, God and creation, there is nothing. There's no time, there's no space. So time is a function of motion, of the relationships between existence, and space is a function of the existence themselves. So God can be thought to be spatial and temporal insofar as that is what it means to be God. It's not that God is in time and space. It is that God is, in his essence, acting. And that acting involves, relations between different things, or different aspects. Things is perhaps the wrong word. Different aspects of God. And so you have, it's between his God acts by his will and power. That's Ibn Taymiyah says that quite often. And so, yes, there's a sense of, you might call it change. Acting is the better term. Ibn Taymiyah rejects the word change, taghayyur, because he says God doesn't change in the sense of God changing his character. It's rather God has a consistent character, but within that character there is activity, there is action. And I use the word dynamic to describe Ibn Taymiyah as a vision of God. And you use the word personal. So personal I just take to mean that God is acting in a sense of, well, God has a will and God intends things and God acts on those intentions. And in that sense, there's a personal aspect. So, is that helpful?
Yeah, it's thank you for your ideas. Because the more you read, the more you can tease out that he seems to have this notion of a kind of divine space-time, where his acting God, if to use your term, or dynamic God, seems to be able to, perpetually create as such. And it's not changing in terms of human or temporal change, but it seems to be a change that's different. I don't know, but it seems to come across if you read his kind of writing that he does seem to have this kind of notion. Because how else could you explain these aspects of creativity when there is no kind of time, divine time? All instances are the same.
Yeah, I mean, you're using the word it seems like. I say, well, it is that way. I mean, it's very clear in his writings that this is the way he thinks. And to what degree is the time different in our world from his world, in God's world? It's not that much, insofar as Ibn Taymiyah says that, it's silly to imagine that God could see something happen, like God yesterday did not see our lecture today, because it didn't happen yet. And so God cannot see things that haven't happened yet. And that's just the way it is, because we're all together in this temporal flow.
Can I throw a loaded term out there?
Sorry?
Could I throw a loaded kind of concept out there? Do you think he's close to the process theologians then?
Right. So I get that question quite frequently. No, insofar as all that occurs for Ibn Taymiyah derives from God himself. Where in process theology, there is the possibility that God could go out of existence. I mean, doesn't seem to happen. But for Ibn Taymiyah, God will never go out. Ibn Taymiyah's God will never go out of existence. God is necessary, a necessary existence for Ibn Taymiyah, and everything that happens in the world, everything that's created in the world, derives from God's perpetual creativity. In a way, in process theology, it's much more God's activity is more dependent on the world itself. Whereas for Ibn Taymiyah, God is in no way dependent on the world, except that the world is a natural outwork, not natural outworking, but is a willed outworking of God's intention.
Thank you. I've got a third one, but I'll just let my other brothers ask their questions first, and I'll come back. Thank you.
Our teacher, Ustad Dr. Safaruk, had a question. And then Mullah Wais has two, so I'll let him come in after you, inshallah. Dr. Safaruk, are you there? I don't know what's happening. Can anybody hear him, or is that just me?
Anyone hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I was just wanted to ask a couple of questions, whether there are some works of Ibn Taymiyah that are perhaps overlooked or not studied properly or thoroughly, like maybe the Tis'iniyah. Do you think there are texts that are worth looking into, especially how he engages with kalam? And two, whether there's quite a lot of discussion in contemporary analytic theology about panentheism and ontological independence and things like that within theism. Do you think Ibn Taymiyah could be a panentheist rather than a process theologian?
Okay, so let's go to the first question about the works that are neglected. Well, there are many Ibn Taymiyah's. There's a lot of works that Ibn Taymiyah wrote and haven't been studied properly. Tis'iniyah is one. He repeats himself a lot, so some might question the value of reading everything, but I think it's worth investigating all of his works quite thoroughly and carefully. And that's a big scholarly project that remains before us by and large. And we need good translations of his major works like Ta'arud. I mean, it's a huge work. To translate that whole thing would be a massive undertaking. But to understand what he's doing and keep the scholarship on him going, more and more work needs to be done, both on the works that are known and the works that are unknown. Okay, panentheism versus process theology. Okay, pardon my ignorance, but I actually thought process theology was a kind of panentheism. And I'm not as strong in contemporary philosophy of religion as I could be to know whether panentheism can be ascribed to Ibn Taymiyah. My suspicion is not, especially if panentheism even is anywhere close to process theology. The answer is no. It's not the same thing Ibn Taymiyah is doing. If we think of Ibn Taymiyah as conceiving God inside the world, the world inside God. If we think of God as being an existent inside of which is the world, yes, we can think about that. But God does not interpenetrate the world. And what little I've read about panentheism, God would interpenetrate the world. There's a mutuality of world and God, or God's body and so forth, that for Ibn Taymiyah would be entirely heretical, insofar as for Ibn Taymiyah, God's ontological existence cannot be in the world, because that would place God in an ontological sense in filthy places, as I mentioned before, like the women's wombs. He sees the Virgin's womb and Virgin Mary's womb and toilets and so on. He doesn't see those as appropriate places for God to be. So, yeah, is that helpful?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thanks, Professor. Definitely. Thank you. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Mullah Wais, if you wanted to turn your mic on and ask your question.
I see a question in the chat, if I may briefly answer it from Ikram ul-Haq, just asking what the name of the encyclopedia I mentioned earlier, written by Ibn Taymiyyah's contemporary. I don't remember the name of the encyclopedia exactly, but the author is an-Nuwayri. So an-Nuwayri is a famous figure in the Mamluk period. So there's a book by Ilyas Muhanna on this whole encyclopedia, looking how it's structured and its features, which is a really good read. So an-Nuwayri is the way to catch up with that. Yeah, thank you. Somebody else put the an-Nuwayri's name in the chat. So yes, I'm ready for the next question.
Well, no worries, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this fascinating presentation. I had two questions, so I think should I ask both of them, or should I ask the first one and then wait for the second one?
Let's go one by one.
Okay, so it was going back to the question regarding ta'wil and translating it as reinterpretation. So if we're saying that ta'wil is a two-step process, would it be fair to say then for Ibn Taymiyyah it's a one-step process? It's just interpretation, given that words on their own would not have meaning. So he wouldn't require the need to then negate the literal meaning, rather he'd just be going to some contextual meaning, if that makes sense. And then the question is, who would assign the context? Because you would naturally then have multiple possibilities. And so, like, one of the things that I felt scratching my head on, and you'll have to excuse me because we've had to study this with our preconceived notions, is the privileging julus, or sitting, as a connotation for istiwa itself then would be some form of interpretation, would it not?
So everything you said fits really well. Yes, he's making one active interpretation as opposed to two. So yes, I would just call it interpretation what he's doing, and he calls it tafsir. Then to take that step though and connect istiwa with julus, I haven't seen him do that, because I'm speaking in English. I'm translating istiwa sitting, not because I'm thinking julus, but because other English words like elevation or what other words do I hear? Settling might work.
Ascending.
Yeah, I always struggle to know exactly it doesn't quite make sense. Whereas sitting on the throne in English has a certain sense, and I don't think of julus in the Arabic word julus. So this is the whole point. Words mean what they mean in context, and perhaps Ibn Taymiyyah would deny. I don't know. I haven't looked into this, whether julus fits with istiwa for him or not. But I hope that's helpful to getting a sense, is that contextual interpretation. From the context, you will know. I think you also raised the question, well, how do you determine the context? It's a really good question. Who determines the context, and how do we get there? So this gets at fundamental epistemological questions. Ibn Taymiyyah affirms that the knowledge that God is above is fitri, is necessary, daruri. It's very widely attested in scripture, Quran, hadith. It is so pervasive a human conviction that you can't deny it. And it's just obvious. So to those who say, well, no, it's not obvious, he's basically saying, well, your fitra's not working. Or, this is kind of at the edges of the debate, really. What is it? How do we know these basic things? So, yeah, he basically appeals to majority opinion, that if you ask anybody on the street where God is, they're going to point up. And there's this hadith about the slave girl who, in some sense, I forget the hadith, but she points up, or she indicates that God is above somehow. So that's more or less what produces the context, is the overwhelming sense of what Scripture says, the overwhelming sense of what reason, what the fitra says, And after that, there's really no appeal as far as I'm concerned. I think every religious tradition comes to the end of its grounds for appeal. That's just the way things work. Non-religious traditions as well. There's a point at which it rests on conviction as opposed to there's any kind of rational foundation. There's always some kind of fundamental principle which you really can't argue.
Thank you very much for that. It helped just understand what I was thinking. Can I just ask one more question?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. You have a second question?
Yeah. So the second question related to page number 32 of your book, where you reference Ibn Taymiyyah's work, Ar-Radd al-Mantiqiyin, and you leave a comment there saying that it also reveals Ibn Taymiyyah's faulty understanding of the standard logical doctrines of his day. But then there's nothing else on this. And I was just interested if there were some other references for this, or if you're hopefully going to develop this in another text. So if you could just share some examples of what this actually means.
Okay, so yes, I would love to develop this some more. But the Khalid al-Ruwayhib has an article in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology, in which he gives an overview of logic in Kalam, particularly al-Ghazālī, and then he talks about Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah, I'm not an expert on logic. It's actually something I want to spend more time on. But Ibn Taymiyyah simply isn't aware of some of the sophisticated stuff, or let's not say sophisticated stuff, but let's say some of the changes in the logical tradition that have occurred, and he's not aware of those and doesn't and simply doesn't speak to them adequately. He makes some mistakes, and Khalid al-Ruwayhib outlines all of that much better than I can at this point. So I would direct you to that article to get details. That's what I'm relying on. I mean, there are no footnotes in the book. It's just the nature of the series. We're not allowed to have any footnotes. And but that's where that's coming from.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. Look forward to reading it. Thank you.
Before I turn over to Ustad Imran to ask his question, I have a very quick question. So in terms of like Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he's very unique and a sort of an anomaly of his time, and he sort of stands out within the Hanbali tradition. In terms of his tradition, the Taymiyyan tradition, it seems like you have Ibn Qayyim and you have like early Taymiyyans, and then the claim is like there's an interregnum where there's Ibn Taymiyyah just goes missing, and then suddenly there's a great revivalist project that takes place in the 19th, early, 20th century, especially obviously the 20th century. How reliable is that, or was there a continuous Taymiyyan tradition from his time until today?
Yeah, this is a question we still need more work on. There is a diffuse Taymiyyan tradition, or a continuous tradition of using him in one form or another. But in the epilogue of my book, I give some examples. Ibn al-Wazir in Yemen is aware of Ibn Taymiyyah and uses some of his ideas, but he's not happy. He's very uncomfortable. Ibn al-Wazir is not a theologian who wants to explore things wherever the reason might lead, wherever the logic might lead. He stops when it gets a little bit nerve-wracking, and so he's not willing to go into the Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas about the attributes of God, which are voluntary, which then raises questions of hawadith fi dhatillah, temporality in God's essence, and all this. You get another, you get use of Ibn Taymiyyah in the Ottoman context, in the called the Zadili context, where some of his ideas against bid'ah are picked up, but those folks are Maturidi, so they're not interested at all in his theology. So that's 16th century. Ibn al-Wazir is the late 14th, early 15th century. So there's always somebody thinking about Ibn Taymiyyah. You have like Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami against Ibn Taymiyah, and his critiques actually are quite accurate of what Ibn Taymiyah says. They're not necessarily distortions; they're just totally repulsive to the likes of Ibn Hajar. So there's a continuous tradition of awareness of Ibn Taymiyah. There's also a tradition of trying to as we referred to earlier, sanitize him, saying he's a great figure, but not looking too deeply at what he's saying, because, as I said with Ibn al-Wazir, that can be a little bit scary, and it can create division. You start going into things that just don't seem to fit together correctly. And so you get a lot of misunderstandings of what he's trying to say, or I shouldn't even say misunderstandings. People just aren't interested in what he's saying. They want to use him for, like any great thinker, you find things in him that are useful to you, you use them, and you carry on. But to adopt his whole theological system, it is different from the Ash'ari Maturidi tradition. And so if you are going to adopt Ibn Taymiyah's whole system, you're going to find yourself outside that Ash'ari Maturidi structure, and socially, that has been quite difficult in the Islamic tradition, in the Sunni tradition for many centuries. Even today, it remains quite difficult to maintain these kinds of views, as you're, I'm sure, well aware, socially, not just intellectually. So, yeah, I hope that helps answer that question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, Professor. Ustad Ibrahim, you had a question? Feel free to turn your mic on.
Yeah, my question is the following. So, how successful do you think is Ibn Taymiyyah with his contextual theory of language to detach meaning from modality? Because obviously he gets accused for doing tashbih, whereas the other ulama generally say you can't have the meaning and not have the modality as well. You can't detach between. But do you feel he is successful in terms of detaching one, and therefore the accusation of tashbih and subsequent tajseem are not warranted?
Okay, does it distinguish ma'na and kayfiyya, meaning and modality, adequately? Well, I'll let philosophers judge that. I'm saying in my book, and this hasn't been articulated that well elsewhere, but as I was thinking about this over the years, it does seem that when he appeals to kayfiyya, it's just when he doesn't want to, it's a question which he doesn't think's worth bothering with, either because it's not helpful for worshiping God. There are certain things that just are distractions. They're questions which aren't worth our time. He takes much more interest in intellectual questions than other traditionalists, because he thinks they're important, because he has to oppose competing ideas. But if there's an intellectual question, like, for example, does God touch the throne? I mentioned this book in German earlier, Farid Suleiman. So I wasn't aware that Ibn Taymiyyah discussed this issue, but Suleiman has found a place where he does, but it's very brief and it's very fuzzy. So I would imagine Ibn Taymiyyah is not, well, I haven't found him being interested in whether God touches the throne, because it's just not, it takes you off track. So from a philosophical point of view, is this satisfying? Maybe, maybe not. So I see the ma'na kayfiyya as basically the boundary line between what Ibn Taymiyyah thinks is important to discuss to get the meaning of the attributes correct for proper worship, and what is not important to discuss for the sake of worshiping God correctly. And okay, can you remind me, is there something about tashbih, and what was the second part of the question?
No, so I was just saying, if he does demarcate between them successfully, then obviously the accusation of tashbih and tajseem would necessarily drop, because you can't extend that by just saying he has a meaning and it doesn't really apply. Because what it is, if you can't detach it, then maybe those are more warranted in terms of the accusation. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So whether Ibn Taymiyyah is guilty of tashbih and tajseem is purely in the eyes of the beholder, based on your own presuppositions about what is correct ontologically. So if you're coming at Ibn Taymiyyah from an Ash'ari framework, Maturidi framework, Mu'tazili framework, then he simply can't. He's going to fail you. But if you're coming from his framework, I mean, he explicitly denies tashbih. I mean, he's not making God similar to us in a certain way. With tajsim, well, do you deny it? He says you shouldn't deny it because the scripture doesn't deny it, but you shouldn't affirm it either because the scripture doesn't affirm it. It all depends on what it means. So there's no way that Ibn Taymiyah himself is going to be able to be reconciled with Ash'ari theology if we're faithful to what he's writing. If you want to, as others have done, channel certain aspects of his thought in certain ways into tafweed or imrad or something like that, then you can make him. I mean, theology at any point in time uses the great figures of the past to its own ends. And, as an historian, I think theologians should be careful that they don't distort what these people are saying in the past. But nonetheless, theologians find things that are interesting in the people of the past, and they have a certain right to use that material in order to articulate a vision of faith which is relevant for the present. So there's these tensions about how we use those, use our heroes of the past, you might say, and also how we use our villains of the past. Respecting the integrity of their systems as they tried to articulate them in their day, and not making them say things which they didn't quite say because you want to sideline them. So it's quite a tricky thing, negotiating the honesty with the past and the needs of the present in terms of articulating a meaningful theology. At least that's how I understand it and how I see it.
Thank you for that. I've got another question I just want to ask, and then I'll pass it over to the other brothers. So just moving away from the attributes for a minute to, for example, Ibn Taymiyah's concept of perpetual creativity. How would you describe his position about, in terms of creation? Is he someone who believes in terms of ex nihilo, or is he someone who's more on the philosophical kind of trend of Avicenna and Ibn Rushd, whereby you can't dissociate between God and his creation? Could you maybe elaborate on that one a little bit, please? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer is both. So from the philosophers, Ibn Taymiyah is taking the idea of God's perfection entailing as a necessary concomitant of God's perfection is creative activity. So God is creating from eternity out of his perfection. So that's something that is shared with Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. However, that doesn't mean that any one part of the world is eternal. And of course, Ibn Taymiyah does not affirm emanation like Ibn Sina at all. So from the Kalam theologians, Ibn Taymiyah adopts the idea, you can call it creation ex nihilo, whatever, that there's a beginning in time to every existent, apart from God, of course. So there has always been a world of one sort or another, but everything we find in the world had a beginning. So as Ibn Taymiyah puts it, the jins, or the genus or the species of the world as a whole has always been, it's min al-azal, it's from eternity. Whereas every existent thing has had a beginning at some point, at some point in time. So this world that we have, the world that was created in 6 days, had a beginning. The world as we know it, with our moon and our planets and all the whole universe as we know it today, had a beginning. But there was something before that as well, the whole way back to pre-eternity, min al-azal. There was never a point at which God was not creating something or another. So it's not kalam, it's not the kalam Ash'ari Mu'tazili approach, and it's not the philosopher's approach either. For Ibn Taymiyah, in contrast to the philosophers, there are no eternal spheres, that have been eternally rotating or revolving. There's no distinction between, the world below the moon, the world above the moon. Everything apart from God had a beginning in existence now, but there's always been something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Just want to add on to it. Then how does he reconcile that? Because it seems in his writings he seems to be a kind of moderate nominalist, but then he has this kind of universal notion or a kind of very general notion of creativity, and then he has particulars of those creativity via created events. Can you see? I'm trying to reconcile in terms of his kind of moderate nominalism. Is he a moderate nominalism, or is he a pragmatic nominalism? Does he accept kind of universal, general, abstract notions? Thank you.
Okay, so Farid Suleiman, in his book came out in 2019, shifts the debate a little bit and calls him a conceptualist. And I have to think about this some more, but it might be a useful way of thinking about it. So Ibn Taymiyah, when it comes to the concept of anything, it's just something in the mind. It doesn't have an external reality. So he's not a realist in the Platonic sense. So going back to the issue of creation, like the jins of creativity, or God, the jins of created things, the genus of created things has no external existence. Apart from the fact there's always been concrete existence, concrete individuals. So I'm not sure if that's helping you. And in God himself, by virtue of God's perfection, by virtue of who God is, by virtue of God's essence, he is always creating by his will and power. That's just who God is. And God doesn't need the creation to be God, but by virtue of God's perfection, God is always producing, is always creating something. And those individual created things have beginnings. And the genus of creation is just a concept in our mind. The genus of created things, is not something that exists out there. Otherwise, you'd have some eternal alongside God. You have some eternal existent alongside God. The concept of the genus of the genus of created things is just a concept in the mind. At least that's the best I can articulate at this point. It's not easy to understand, perhaps, but
the reason I say that is because you emphasize his empirical approach, that he feels things need to be in the empirical realm, and now all of a sudden he makes a shift where he gives a conceptual concept and it attributes it to God and says God has this conceptual notion which doesn't exist outside in the empirical realm. Doesn't make sense. I'm just trying to work out the consistency.
God's activity is definitely in the realm of the real. I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. So everything that God's doing is in the realm of existing things outside the mind.
But then the creativity, the perfect nature of it is a concept in the mind. I'm finding that one a bit difficult to get anyway. But I'll leave it. I'll leave that one there. Thank you.
I had a very quick question again before I move on to. You spoke about the non-cognitivists. Ibn Qudama, and your recent paper, I think that came out recently, was the Ash'ari opposition to Ibn Taymiyah, Badruddin ibn Jama'ah, Ibn Jabhal and others. Was there a non-cognitivist backlash that Ibn Taymiyah faced for his views?
Yes. So Dhahabi, for example, really couldn't go for this. There's, I think it's Ibn Modi, one of Ibn Taymiyah's, somebody, I think he was a follower, I'd have to look, but basically, yes, there was a backlash. There was a deep, profound reticence to do what he was doing. So the Katerina Bori has an article, again, in the 2010 edited volume, Ibn Taymiyah in his Times, where she documents some of this opposition, or some of this reticence. Opposition might be too strong a word because he was such a powerful figure, but disagreement with him from the Shafi and the Hanbali traditionalists that I'm calling non-cognitivists. So yeah, and ongoing, of course, throughout the tradition thereafter too.
Thank you very much. We have, I think, a couple of questions that I am cognizant of the time. We've had you for nearly an hour and 10 minutes, I think, or longer. I will, just in order, Maulana Shaheen, if you wanted to turn on your mic and ask whatever question you possibly had.
Good afternoon, Professor, and thank you for your PDF and your subsequent lecture. I really enjoyed your reading the chapter actually. My question was about the consistency of Ibn Taymiyah. So, in your opinion, was Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyah rahimahullah consistent in applying his theories, whether it's the theory of language, his empiricism, or various other theories that he quite strongly and firmly held? Were there any cases where he perhaps falls into double standards or some sort of inconsistency or incoherence, or at least from his perspective or his from his framework? So I don't mean from his from an Ash'ari perspective or a Mu'tazili perspective or something like that. From within, is there an internal consistency, or to what extent do you feel there is an internal consistency? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, there's a remarkable internal consistency that is generally underappreciated. And a lot of my work has been trying to bring that out. That's not to say he's not human, though. There are points where he isn't always consistent. Again, I refer to Farid Suleiman's book on Ibn Taymiyyah's attributes, 2019. And Suleiman's very perceptive in picking up points where Ibn Taymiyyah shifts a little bit. Sometimes he says certain terms shouldn't be used, and then he goes and uses them. But Suleiman will also say then, yeah, but he's using them in a somewhat different sense. Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes says things which it looks like they contradict what his overall picture completely. But then you start digging deeper, and there's you can explain it. I mean, it's like a big web that fits together. So yes, there's a remarkable consistency, but he's still a human being who I think, no more, no less than any other intellectual let's put it this way, doesn't pull everything together that could be pulled together. Sometimes he fudges things, as many of us do. Because he just doesn't quite know what to think about them, or he doesn't know how to resolve them. And I have identified this in my 2007 book, where on certain issues of God's predetermination of human acts and our human responsibility, he does fudge and just stops dealing with the question, because if he goes into the question, he's going to undermine his overall purpose of trying to present God's activity in the world as good, as wise. And fundamentally, he's about having us worship. Ibn Taymiyyah wants us to think well of God, husn al-zan, to think well of God, so we worship God. And so he wants to be as consistent as he can be, but as is the nature of human thought, when it comes to God and the world, it can be very difficult to be entirely consistent. And that's part of I would argue myself that's part of the sign that God is different, that there's a certain brokenness in our speech with respect to the divine, because we are just creatures. And there are those limits to our creaturely language and our creaturely abilities to fathom all this and to gain all that. And I think Ibn Taymiyyah would agree with that, actually. But he's not interested in acknowledging it too openly, because then people might think poorly of God. He really doesn't like people thinking poorly of God's actions. When the Ash'aris, for example, say God has no purposes. Well, if you say God doesn't have any purposes in his acts, people are likely to think God is irrational and capricious, and Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't want any of that. If you were to say that God has purposes in his acts, and you work that through, and then you might say, I don't know quite what the purpose is on this point or that point, that is not as dangerous to Ibn Taymiyyah in terms of advancing, that we think well of God, so we worship God and we praise God. I mean, it's about praising God, not just thinking well of God, but giving God due praise. So, I hope that's helpful in answering that question.
That was very helpful. Thank you. And my second question, if I may, was, did Ibn Taymiyyah influence non-Muslim theologians, just as Hujjatul Islam al-Ghazālī had considerable influence on the likes of St. Thomas Aquinas and the contemporary William Lane Craig, and I believe some Jewish theologians as well? has Ibn Taymiyyah been received in the same way? Of course, not in the same way, but has he had any influence on outside of the Muslim tradition?
I'm not aware of any, as it were, positive influence. The negative, his big refutation of Christianity, Jawab Sahih, was known very early in Europe. Not in his own day, but I forget what the earliest mentioned is, but certainly before the 1800s. And so there's that sense, awareness of his presence. But I'm not aware of any, people using him to develop their own theology outside the Islamic tradition.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just finishing up. Dr. Safaruk, you had a question? Do you want to come in? And then...
Professor, thank you again for going way beyond the time. We do really appreciate that, you giving us this time. If I can be sort of ask a kind of instructor's question. One, how would you recommend students, recommend us all, going about sort of undertaking our academic studies? Obviously, a lot of us rely on your output on Ibn Taymiyyah, the scholarly output that you've sort of, over the arc of like 2 decades. And that's influenced people's understanding and reading and appreciation of Ibn Taymiyyah. Is there any sort of advice on what students ought to do to get that kind of grounding, that kind of scholarly grounding? Second of all, and you can dodge this if you want, really, it's just, I'm just being a bit cheeky. The figures and intellectual thinkers that you've studied, over the course of your academic career, do you find any of them creeping into influencing your own perspectives, whether that's confessional, I don't want to be presumptive, or whether that's just generally how your own perspective in general?
Okay, so first the general question. I mean, essential to the field of Islamic intellectual history is Arabic. I mean, there's just no way around it. So that's the basis. In terms of regrets, in retrospect, I mean, the smartest thing I could have done much earlier in my career would have been to sit down and read Ibn Sina for a year. There's just no way you can get around Ibn Sina if you're going to work in Islamic intellectual history after him. He's everywhere. And apart from that, it really depends on the particular area you're interested in, and what it is you're looking for, and what you want to do professionally and academically. Academia these days is very highly specialized, and so there's simply not enough life to become a generalist in everything. So I said earlier, I myself want to do more work on logic. I'm trying to understand. I simply don't have the background, so we need to grow. Let's put it this way. You always need to be growing. You need to be stretching at some place in your academic interests in order to keep moving the boundaries, keep going outward. What was the second question again? Whether any of these figures have seeped into my own thinking?
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, there's no way that you can avoid reflecting upon and thinking about the implications of what you're reading for life in general. And where I make this most explicit, there's an article I published in 2009, I think. It's in a journal in Canada. It's available on my websites, the University of Nottingham website or my Google Sites website. You can download it if you want to look at it. So I call it Islamic Monotheism and the Trinity. And so there I do a comparative Christian-Muslim exercise on the nature of God. And I work with the categories of God's essence, God's attributes, God's acts, and then with Ibn Taymiyyah and others too, you have the idea of the uluhiyya or the ilahiyya, the obligation or the claim that God's nature makes upon you in terms of loyalty and worship. So, you can be a judge of that, of whether I'm being influenced by the Muslim thinkers I'm working on in that discussion there. So yeah, I mean, it's inevitable that anything we involve ourselves in has an impact on us, and it needn't be. I think this is part of the engagement of academia. It's part of the engagement of life is to work with different ideas and think about what they mean, and then sort them and sift them. I think, you know, intellectual development and what we do in universities, and I hope what people are doing more generally in their intellectual endeavors, is trying to gain a deeper sophistication, become more sophisticated at sifting ideas which are true, I mean, beautiful and valuable and right. So to go back to the very basics.
Oh, no, brilliant. Thank you for that. I mean, obviously you can't see me because I haven't got the camera on, but I skipped a little bit of joy when you talked about logic. So, you know, I think it's very, very important, definitely, because even our thinkers, they're engaging with concepts, perhaps not realizing in a logical way. And you're right. I mean, post Avicenna, everyone's breathed it and it's in their lungs.
Yeah.
So, you know, whether they're engaging with his logic or his metaphysics. So, I really appreciate the honest answers, Professor. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let me say thank you for this opportunity to speak with all of you. I really appreciate your questions, and I wish you well in the in your ongoing studies of the Risalah Qudsiyyah. It's an interesting text, and I wish you all a wonderful Eid.
Professor, before as just a closing remarks, there's a few, I don't know if you can see in the chat, just a closing thing on what are you, especially with the lockdown at the moment, and I'm assuming all you're doing is reading Ibn Taymiyah. So what are you working on at the moment? What's coming soon? And I mean, you can see the chat questions, so if you could just elaborate slightly on those, and then we'll finish on.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Yes. So no, I'm not just reading Ibn Taymiyah. I'm trying to help the University of Nottingham prepare educational curriculum for the next year's big challenges. I'm sure you're aware in universities in the UK and elsewhere in the world, and we have to work really hard to give to make a solid provision for the autumn in very challenging circumstances. So that takes most of my time. So what am I working on? Let's see here, current and future research. I mentioned earlier that I have this project working on Ibn Taymiyah's retraction to get out of prison in 1307. I want to do a lot more with that and put that together into a large article or a small book. I continue to work on God's attributes in Ibn Taymiyah generally. And as was mentioned earlier, lots of text which need more work in this regard. And I have a project translating Fakhruddin Ar-Razi's Ta'sis at-Taqdis, which I need to get back to. And we need a good English translation of that. So I'm, it's an interesting text. It's the text that Ibn Taymiyah himself wrote against in his Bayan Talbisa Jahmiyyah. And then there's another question there. What area do I feel needs to be explored in Taymiyyah thought? Well, I mentioned earlier that the need for translations, solid translations that are based on a good understanding of his thought, and that does take time. I appreciate, and more within his context. There's more work needs to be done in Ibn Taymiyah's theological and religious context to see what's going on there, to understand his, the episodic aspects of his writing. So he doesn't write systematic treatises, generally speaking. He responds to things. So I said earlier he's consistent. He's remarkably consistent, but yet he does respond in different ways to different people in different situations. So much more work can be done. How can we understand that theoretically? Another question: how do I rate the recent scholarship on Ibn Taymiyah? Which stands out for me in particular? Well, there are several monographs out recently. The Farid Suleiman's work in German is excellent, and I hope it can be translated into English. We have Karl Sharif Tobri's work just came out earlier this year on Ta'arud, the averting the conflict between revelation and reason. And the chapters in there analyzing Ibn Taymiyah's dar are excellent in terms of theology. You have Sophia Vasilou's work on Ibn Taymiyah's theological ethics. I think that's 2016, a big work which really does a fine job of showing how Ibn Taymiyah writes in different ways in different contexts. In fact, that's a consistent theme of the book, that he says this over here, then he says this over here, and it can really be to the external, or to somebody from the outside, it seems like it's dizzying. And so she brings on that aspect of his thought, but yet there is nonetheless an internal coherence. And somebody mentioned Yasser Qadhi's PhD. That's an excellent piece of work as well, although he hasn't published it. And it would require a little bit of work to publish it, I believe. But let's see, I'm sure I've missed things. There are many, many articles in edited volumes that are worth reading. And
what do you think about Uwaymir Anjan, his book on the politics of Ibn Taymiyyah?
Yes, okay. So that book is, I have certain disagreements with it, but by and large, it's an excellent experiment of trying to see how Ibn Taymiyyah's thought fits in, how his political thought might fit in with respect to al-Ghazālī. I think he's not quite got it quite right, but that's, it's an excellent intervention in the discourse and the discussions. And yeah, I see Livnat Holtzman. So Livnat Holtzman's expertise is primarily Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, and she's done more than anybody else to bring out his thinking. And the book by her student Mariam Ovadia, I have a review of that book in the Journal of Islam and Christian Muslim Relations, so you can see that there. With Ibn Qayyim in general, there's a lot more work to do on his theology. He's written so much, and that's a whole new a new horizon, you might say, in terms of research. I mentioned Katerina Bori before. Her work is always solid, and particularly on Ibn Taymiyyah's, she's working now on his Siyasa Shar'iyya, and she has something you can obtain online on that, which looks at the fact that there are two different editions of it, and the newer edition, which is printed in the Athar Shaykh al-Islam series in Saudi Arabia, has more material in it, which rounds out the text, and it's really fascinating. In fact, my section on the Siyasa Shar'iyya in the book Ibn Taymiyyah, the One World academic book just published, is based on that, on Katerina's work as well as the newer edition. So I feel really bad. I'm sure I've missed many other fine scholars who are working in the field, and I keep a running list people on my Google Sites website. I keep a list of scholarship in English and other European languages on Ibn Taymiyyah, and you can find more there. And if there's anything missing, you're welcome to send me something. Send me an email, and I can add it there.
I think on that note, I just want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to you, Professor, for giving us your time. I know, like you just mentioned, you're awfully busy, not really Ibn Taymiyyah, but working very hard, and I pray that hopefully that there's blessing in your work, and in the tribulation and in the situation we're in the world right now, we pray that God lifts it from us in a way that is a way of blessing and mercy for us. But thank you very much for your time, for giving us your time. We may be having Uwaymir on at some point to do political philosophy, but that's we're going to see how that one plays out. But once again, from the Karima Foundation, I'm very, very thankful to you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and many blessings on all of you.